anyone can be trained in psychological first aid, even someone with no psychological background, ensuring that they are physiologically feeling stable and back to baseline. So offering them water, making sure they're warm enough, taking them from...
I mean, if it's a fire, they're already warm. Anyway, yeah.
Oh, well, you said it. But,
I'll just share an instance with you. Do we have time? How much time?
Still at least 10 minutes.
We have 10 more minutes. What else to talk about?
you could ask
I'll
about...
just tell a story. We teach our students about counseling, we teach them about intervention strategies, etc. And I've done a clinical course. But I always found that we don't really teach them what to do when a psychological distressing event takes place,
Yeah.
right? Like we'll explain anxiety and we'll explain a panic attack and we'll tell them the treatment methods. But almost never are we teaching people what to do if a panic attack happens with somebody else. What is your responsibility? Hello and welcome to the JIBS podcast. I'm your host Bhaskar. Today we are going to talk about a very interesting topic known as psychological first aid. And we're joined by Samreen Chabra. She's a lecturer at the Institute and she teaches a course on this topic. And she's an expert at what psychological first aid is all about. We all know about first aid in terms of medicine, and when an accident happens, you know what you're supposed to do. But there's also a concept of psychological first aid, and we'll get into that through Samreen. Samreen, if you could please tell us, what does psychological first aid entail?
Hi, Bhaskar.
Hi.
First of all, thank you for having me. So psychological first aid is a lot like real first aid, except it's meant for wounds of the mind or things to do that are more psychological in nature. So the idea really is to just ensure that the damage is controlled and that the problem doesn't get worse. So okay, let's imagine that, you've just encountered someone on the road who might have suffered like a cut or something. If it's well within your ability to handle this, you will dress the wound. You could take them home and like put some Dettol and cotton and all of that. But if you see someone having a cardiac arrest, it's best to recognize that it falls out of, your own set of abilities. So you would take this person to an expert, right? You would call an ambulance, take them to a hospital. Similarly, with psychological first aid, if you see someone in distress, you can ensure that they're feeling physically safe, mentally safe. You could also, connect them to their loved ones or foster some hope in them, in their narrative. But if you recognize that this is someone, that might need like expert care, you would refer them to an expert, like a therapist. Or
So essentially it's a similar concept where what we know as traditionally first aid, what is physiological first aid, let's say, is when there is an event that requires a medical intervention or an intervention that will reduce the chances of someone suffering a major problem, right? So psychological first aid then is when you interject or you have an intervention where someone might be having some level of distress or any kind of stimuli that takes place in their life that leads to some psychological problem, illness, and then you come in and then as a psychological first aid expert, let's say, or someone who's trained in this, will come and help out.
You're close, but the thing is that anyone can be trained in psychological first aid, even someone with no psychological background. So I would be cautious of calling it an intervention. It's not really something that comes from a place of having studied psychology. It's a basic life skill. So if you meet a stranger while you're traveling in a train and you see them crying, you would want to make sure that you help that person, but in a way that, yes, ideally, if you like them, suppose, but you would at least want to make sure that you don't make matters worse, right? So you would ensure that they're feeling safe. You ask them what their needs might be, and what you can do for them, essentially, right? And a big thing about critical events is that it really damages our sense of self-worth. So talking to them about that, equipping them with maybe helping them make a list of their immediate contacts that they can reach out to. Or if it's a more extreme case, someone who may have run away from home, running away from violence, for example, we also want to ensure that we could connect them to legal aid or to an agency that deals with these specific kinds of cases. So
I like how you said about critical events, but it's also a basic life skill, meaning that psychological first aid essentially can be applied if you're trained in it.
Yeah.
At any time in someone else's life or your own.
Yeah.
And then the gravity of the problem is dependent on
it's a spectrum,
right? Where the critical event is an extreme event, and then maybe someone is crying for some other reason, right? They're leaving home or something like that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So okay, now that is clear, that it's an intervention, because it's not like an intervention need not always be very scientifically valid.
Right.
Anyone can intervene at it.
Yeah.
From that perspective, then, what are the ways in which someone will do this, right? What like, we know first aid, you have to have Band-Aid, Dettol, cotton, all of these things. So what are those things, elements in a psychological first aid scenario?
Yeah, I think a big part of conducting any kind of psychological first aid, first of all, is to recognize what it is not, because there's so many myths around it. So it is not diagnosing, it is not labeling, it does not involve counseling or even asking a person to analyze what happened to them. Because this person, this PFA interventionist, cannot actually do anything with those answers. The only answers that we need is how we can help this person immediately. What are their current concerns? So there's a framework that we follow. There are stages to psychological first aid. So the 3 L's, which is look, listen, and link. So you know, let's say you're maybe volunteering with Amnesty International or the UN, just to give you an example, or at a smaller scale, if you find yourself in a locality where a fire has just broken out. You enter the scenario, of course, if it is deemed safe now, and you take a look and you just see who needs your help first. It could be someone who's physically injured and someone who's crying. Who would you help first? Personally, who would you help first?
Someone who's physically injured.
Yes, because it's time sensitive. It could be a matter of life and death. So that's the look part, assessing who needs your help, who needs it first, and to what extent. So you help out this person, you dress their wounds, you calm them down, you come back maybe for the person who was crying, take them out. Again, ensuring that they are physiologically feeling stable and back to baseline. So offering them water, making sure they're warm enough, taking them from...
I mean, if it's a fire, they're already warm. Anyway,
well, you said it. But just, I guess ensuring that they are in a state to express themselves in a safe way. So we take care of the physiological needs, including temperature. So there's that. And also taking them away from the site of where... And so that's the look part. The listen part is where you introduce yourself, you approach someone, tell them why you're here, what you might be hoping to do, and then ask them what their current concerns are. In this case, if someone's lost their home in a fire, the concerns would be very different. It would extend to maybe, I would want to be connected with a real estate agent maybe at some point, because I would have to rebuild a house. So even...
So not at the immediate level, but at the immediate level, you'll probably just deal with their own emotional upheaval. That
seeing maybe if there's like belongings that they can still salvage. Are there...
family members?
Yes, absolutely. But even, that contact list of experts does fall within the purview of the PFA interventionist. And then there's link, which is where you link them to an expert. So,
So it's okay. It's not like, you're right when you say it's not an intervention, because you're not trying to solve the issue. You're just trying to make sure that you process this person to the direction that best fits their requirement.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I like the bit where you said that till now for me, right, when I used to hear the term psychological first aid, it almost seemed like it's withdrawn or it's away from normal first aid. But it's nice that you said that first you look and you check on who requires help and the physiological thing requires help and you intervene there. So essentially they're not just psychological first aid interventionists, but also people who know
basic first aid.
Right?
It's very interwoven. Definitely.
And does it also involve other people in the scenario? For instance, say someone is having a cardiac arrest, right? And this person, they are trained in the CPR, right? And now they're dealing with this person who's requires help, but there are obviously other people around probably. So does that also entail look, listen, and link with the other onlookers who may be family members of this person?
Oh, sure. If there are stakeholders like family members, the link part definitely comes in. Family members present may not be fully comfortable with you as a stranger taking this person to the hospital. They'll be like, I'm here, I can do it, thanks. So, and then PFA ends there. So there will be levels
There
to
may
it.
be where, like, say, one of the family members is feeling distress,
Yes,
right? So
And would-
dealing with them.
for sure. But then, of course, address the time-sensitive thing
Yeah,
first.
of course, yeah.
Do the CPR if you're trained, or
Yeah.
call someone.
Yeah.
And then you cater to this.
Great. So it's a skill then I think would be something that's applicable to just about everybody.
Yes.
Right? Because ideally everyone should be trained in first aid, I'm guessing. Not guessing, I hope. But also that people like who are in the, say, fire brigade, right?
Yeah.
People who handle emergency services in an
Absolutely.
hospital.
Yes.
So it's a training that all of them require then.
That is correct. Even first responders of any nature within prisons as well, like wardens, teachers, right? School counselors, because not every child is going to show up and
Right.
talk to you about
Correct.
their whole history
Yeah,
of
yeah.
academic struggle.
Yeah.
They might just need a very basic, immediate
Yeah. And sometimes
listener.
listen, right?
Yeah,
Like if you
exactly.
listen, hear them out.
Exactly. So there's the idea is to also, recognize that this is removed from cliche sort of comforting. We're not trying to say things like everything happens for a reason,
Yeah.
you will be fine, other people have it worse. So that is very well outside of the framework of PFA.
Okay.
It follows a format and a structure. So yeah.
So it's a very interesting thing, and I think it's something that should be taught, irrespective of,
True.
like you said, if you study psychology or not.
Yeah.
And I'm very glad that it's a cross-elective at our university that people across the board can learn something.
Absolutely.
Like this. I'll just share a story with you, this is something I've felt very often with psychology. It's that we teach our students about counseling, we teach them about intervention strategies, etc. And I've done a clinical course, but I always found that we don't really teach them what to do when a psychological distressing event takes place,
Yeah.
right? Like we'll explain anxiety and we'll explain a panic attack and we'll tell them the treatment methods, but almost never are we teaching people what to do if a panic attack happens with somebody else. What is your responsibility? And I think that's what happens when you teach psychological first aid.
Big time.
Right?
I mean, I think people who don't come from a psychology background, maybe it's like a completely plain blank canvas, right, to play around with, and they're receiving information like this on empathy, equanimity for the first time. But people who come from a psychological background, myself included, we have this tendency to be tempted to just be carried away. And I often do demonstrations in class where I ask two students to enact or role play a sort of PFA scenario. And a lot of the times they do have this tendency to ask questions like, so how does that make you feel? And I'm like, no, that's not what we're trying to get at all.
That's what happens in your therapy room, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you reserve it for that. And also, if you ask this question, what will you do with the answer? You're not equipped. You're not equipped to handle it. So again, it's
mirroring would not work at that point, right? I had this event when I first started teaching. In a college back home, and one of the students, she was giving her exam, right, and then she just collapsed on the table, right, and didn't know what to do. And at that point I realized that I have a master's degree in psychology, but I really don't know what to do with this girl, right? And for some reason I think it was trained, and I will not attribute this to my psychological training, but because of, say, when you go trekking and all of these things, you learn all these different
practical
exposure. And I sort of immediately knew that she's having a sort of a seizure, right? And like caught her face, opened up her jaw, put my finger inside and took out her tongue, so otherwise she'll choke on it, right? That's the most risky thing that happens in that kind of a scenario.
Yeah.
And then we put a spoon on top and then sort of took her to the hospital. And on later when we called, like the doctors checked on her, it turned out she had like conversion disorder, right? Where the person is not really
there
having a seizure, but it's quote unquote put on, but it's like the disorder is that you're enacting in that manner. And that's when I realized that our education and training is not really, they'll tell you what a panic attack is, they'll tell you what, go to therapy or take medicine, but that's where your subject comes in, right?
It's true.
Psychological first aid would be look, listen, and link.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, Samreen, for exploring this entire space and actually teaching this. It's very important and I think required. And I'm sure your students are doing great in terms of treating other people well. And
I hope so. I hope so. Thank you so much for having me, and this was great fun. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. We hope that you learned about psychological first aid and how it can be part of normal first aid as well as separate. Do listen in for more such informative talks on the JIBS Infotainment channel. You can like, share, and subscribe.
Yeah.
You can comment also. And yeah, I'm Bhaskar, and thank you so much for being here.